Hello, hello.
There you go.
So Roy, would you like to introduce our speaker, or did you say maybe that Don Neely was going to give him some words?
I've asked Don, certainly I've asked Don Neely if he wouldn't mind doing this, since it's his chapter, and Don is the chapter director for St. Matthew's in Austin, and Jeff is a member of that chapter. Brother Don, you want to go ahead and introduce the speaker? Thank you.
Don, can you hear us? Don, can you hear us?
Oh, if I can do it.
Yeah, it looks like he's frozen up.
He did. He might have frozen.
Oh,
there you
go.
Brother Don. Brother Don, would you introduce the speaker tonight?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank
you. Can you hear me all?
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you.
Roy, I think his internet service must be bouncing up and down. So maybe if you go ahead and give us the introduction, maybe
I will be glad to. Okay, brothers, we're pleased to have. Go ahead, Don.
Oh, do you want me to speak or not?
Yes, if you can.
Okay.
Your internet keeps cutting in and out.
Yeah, all right. So Jeff Jury is our speaker today, and he is a nationally recognized mediator and arbitrator whose experience as a neutral party is supported by significant trial, appellate, and administrative practice. He also is a member of the adjunct faculty at the University of Texas Law School, where he teaches classes in negotiation and mediation. And so Jeff will discuss some flexible creative processes to move disputes into resolution, and he'll describe his practical methods.
That's a pretty good intro. We've got to be adaptable and flexible. Yes, that's true. So thank you for that, Don. Hello, everybody. Nice to be with you this evening. I'm going to share screen. I have been arm wrestling with share screen and making sure that it doesn't cause some problems, but we are going to be flexible, because that's one thing. If nothing else, can you see that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fantastic. So the title of my program is To Wage Peace Where You Can, Dispute Resolution as a Function of Discipleship. Get the slides to advance. There we go. That's me. I'm now affiliated with Lakeside Mediation in Austin, Texas. I'm a full-time professional peacemaker. I have the best job in the world outside of being a dad, which is to be able to help people resolve disputes. Many of
I think, is everyone else still live, or?
We can't hear, I can't hear
Yeah,
him.
Jeff, I think Jeff's screen locked up.
Uh-oh.
Jeff, can you hear us? Oh. What's going on with the world's internet tonight?
On that same Austin link, I'm afraid.
Let's see. We'll get him back on here in just a second, I'm sure. It looks like he totally dropped, doesn't it? Right. I don't see him.
I'm back.
Oh, there he is. Oh, okay.
Back under the name Will Archer, whose account I'm having to use. So why don't we do this? I make a living talking as well as listening. So I'm just going to talk. If you would, please, Conrad or Roy, if you can send the PowerPoint out later. Let's just do this the old-fashioned way. And I'll try to keep this entertaining. So in our time this evening, what I'd like to do is really talk about 4 different topics. One is to contrast for you the difference between conflict and dispute. The second thing is we're going to talk about the kinds of questions that cause people to debate. Third, we're going to talk about the recipes for disputes. And then fourth, we're going to talk about some conflict and dispute resolution methods. You know them. You just may not have applied them in the ways we'll talk about tonight. But before we do that, I'd like everybody to take a moment and think about their favorite comfort food. Now, there's a pedagogical reason for this. I'd like you to think about it and put it in the chat. Just whatever comes to your mind. For me, it would probably be macaroni and cheese. If you think about your favorite comfort food and put it in the chat, you don't need to do it immediately. Think of it if you like. I'm going to come back to the very important topic of comfort food and how it relates to our program tonight. And I see some good answers coming in already. So, conflict and dispute. People talk about conflict, people talk about dispute. Is there a difference? Brothers, I'd tell you that there is, in those of us who think about this academically and also those of us who help people through it. A conflict is something that is just an incompatibility or a variance. If we have any traffic engineers out there, I learned very early in my career working on accident cases that traffic engineers talk about 2 streets that meet like this. Some of us call it an intersection. The traffic engineer calls it a conflict. And it doesn't matter if it's an on-ramp, off-ramp, intersection, yield lane, 30-degree angle intersection. Those are all conflicts. And the subject of traffic engineering is resolving those conflicts, not unlike what we do as conflict resolution professionals. It's anything that is not parallel. Anything that doesn't move along in perfect parallelness, if they do cross, that's a conflict. Now, conflict is normal, it's healthy. We probably wouldn't survive as a species if we didn't have conflict. You may be thinking, but I was listening to the news, I read the paper and I see that there's too much conflict, and it seems that so much of the world is completely stuck. True. One of the things that we do in mediation world is we think of ourselves, and I describe to my students at UT Law School, this is a process of getting people unstuck. So the stuckedness that happens when people are in conflict is something natural, normal, it's everywhere. And what we try to do is we try to manage it. We try to manage it because for all of the many problems in the world really does turn pretty well. And so many of conflicts, they naturally work themselves out. And you often hear about the ones that end up in a dispute. A dispute is an unmanaged or an escalated conflict. It becomes a competition or a struggle. So we go beyond a simple generic explanation for two things that are not parallel, things that are simply incompatible. What happens when it escalates? It's not managed, it's not well attended or considered by the participants. It becomes a dispute. Now, I have in the PowerPoint slides, you'll see an overhead of an intersection in Austin, Texas, that shows quite a bit of confluence of a number of highways coming together. There's also a pinstripe uniform of the Chicago Cubs, my favorite baseball team, which shows a round emblem on a field of pinstripes. Those are all conflicts. You will see 3 slides from the British Museum that show the 5th century BC, the 7th century BC, the Greeks and the Assyrians are carving stone art in the frieze of the Parthenon and also elsewhere in, there you go, in some of their houses of worship. If you can go to the next 3 slides, these are disputes. And look, we have people slinging arrows. You're going to see the first one, which is from the Parthenon. Here is a dispute. You have sword to sword, shield to shield. The next one I like very much because it shows people's heads peering over a wall. Peering over a wall whilst behind them soldiers are marching back and forth and against each other. The idea of a conflict is something that tends to put people behind walls and creates barriers that we have to work through. So when I think about conflicts and disputes, I like to think about the different language that we use, and I'm going to share with you the difference in language that we use when we talk about it as professionals who try to help people work through conflict and dispute. And in the next slide, the way that we talk about it in the profession, conflict is something that is to be avoided or to be managed. For those of you who've had business careers, there are books about what the cost of conflict is in an organization. It doesn't have to be business, it can be public sector. The idea of what do you do if you can't avoid a conflict, you try to manage it. In our language, when we talk about disputes, we usually talk about them being processed and we talk about them being resolved. So how we express it in language, the differences in the approach that we end up using in order to meet conflict and dispute, conflict, and then processing or resolving disputes. So we're talking about when we're discussing managing conflict, avoiding conflict, and then what happens when people end up in a dispute. The questions that underlie conflict and dispute, and I want to talk about the questions that people debate. screen share is just not cooperating, is it?
I can move forward on it. Jeff, you just tell me when you want me to move to the next slide.
You know, if nobody minds, how about we just sync the PowerPoint?
All right.
Because I don't need it when I'm here talking with my brothers. All right. So what kinds of things do people debate? They generally debate three different kinds of questions: questions of fact, questions of value, and questions of policy or action. Now, if we talk about questions of fact, facts are things that are known. The Latin origin of the word fact that we have in our language, in Latin, something that is done. So in some sense, a fact is something that is done. It's something that exists. It exists now, and it exists retrospectively. We can look at a resource material, something that's authoritative, and we can find an answer. That's a fact. So when people dispute about facts, they're really arguing, if you go back to the Latin origin of the word, they're arguing about done things. If you're arguing about what is a fact, you're arguing about something that's done. You can find an answer if you seek it. And, you know, although it may have qualifications or multiple parts, there is an identifiable answer. For example, I'm going to ask a question of fact. Who won the 2020 presidential election? Well, this is not a political presentation. I'm not asking for an answer. Don't put it in the chat. But that's a fact, or at least it's positioned as a fact in the news media, and it's a point of controversy for some people. It's a thing that people debate. They're debating about a done thing. If you understand that that's what someone is debating, changing somebody else's opinion or view about a known thing usually doesn't work. It will only work when someone's mind is open. Now, for those of you who remember the summer of 1974, when the House Judiciary Committee was voting articles of impeachment on President Nixon, there was a congressman from Indiana named Earl Landgrebe. He may have been from Ohio, but he was somewhere in the near Midwest. And he was quoted as saying, "Don't confuse me with the facts. I have a closed mind." Now, I admire that honesty. Without probably understanding the kinds of things we understand now about conflict, Congressman Landgrebe was beautifully honest. Don't confuse me with facts because my mind is closed. So when you recognize that if you are debating a fact with someone, in my world, that's usually a waste of time. We can't really help people resolve debates about facts by any means other than resort to an authoritative source. If people don't agree about what an authoritative source is, I can't help them with that. And part of what we do in the profession when we're helping people work through disputes or manage conflict is we recognize where we cannot help them. And if there are these kinds of debates, the honest, faithful answer to someone is, I can't help you with that. You know, I can't decide that for you. I can't help you make a decision other than by giving you an opportunity to change your mind or to open your mind, which is a lot harder than you might think. So let's talk about the second type of thing people debate and get into disputes about, which are questions of value, which is a frequent battleground. A question of value, who or what is worthier or better? On questions of value, there usually is not an authoritative reference, or that reference only becomes authoritative when people agree it's authoritative. It depends on how people weigh facts. And please, Brother Clayton, just put your question in the chat and I'll try to field them in process or maybe at the end. And be sure to cut me off because I love talking about this topic and I want to make sure we have questions at the end. Questions of value depends on individual judgment and how people weigh facts. I'm gonna give you an example of a question of value. Who was a better president between, well, okay, maybe we'll stop there. Let's do a different topic. Do we have any baseball fans here? As you can see, I'm a baseball nut. Some people think I'm a plain nut. Baseball fans, feel free to unmute and answer this question. Who was the greatest home run hitter of all time? Look at them running to unmute. I know somebody has an opinion about that.
Hank Aaron.
Hank Aaron, thank you. Hank Aaron, for a long time, hit the most home runs. Anybody have a different answer? We're going to have any takers on Barry Bonds?
There isn't a home run hitter of greatest of all time because time's not over with yet.
Ah, that's a great answer. That's a great answer. Some people think Barry Bonds because Barry Bonds hit more home runs over a career than Henry Aaron. Some people think that Babe Ruth was a better home run hitter than Henry Aaron because he hit home runs more frequently. So does anybody know offhand who hit home runs with the greatest frequency with a minimum of 1,000 at bats? This will make some people irritated. The answer to that is Mark McGwire.
Whoa.
So in terms of home run frequency, my point is not necessarily to get into discussions about baseball statistics and merit, which I would love to do another day. There is no way to establish an answer unless there is a common frame of reference. Does it mean most home runs in a career? Does it mean the most frequent rate at which a home run is hit? Does it mean the longest home run? Those are all questions of judgment. Just like think about so many of the disagreements that are intractable today or that may be intractable in your life, in your work, in your family. Most of them will probably involve a question of judgment. And sometimes, I don't know if anybody other than I have felt this way, if somebody would only view things like I do, we wouldn't have this problem. If somebody would only be sensible, which means see the world the way that I see it, gee, wouldn't it be a better place? If people thought like I thought, if I were only in charge of the world, if I were king of the United States, things would run a lot better. And that's all infused with judgment, applying our own standards to the situation and being frustrated when others don't. I'm going to talk about the third kind of questions that people debate before I answer the question in the chat. The last category of questions that people debate are questions of policy or action. Now that's a question of what we are going to do. How often do we get bogged down in meetings of all kinds? Or it can be, where are we going to have supper tonight? What would you like for supper? How many times do people get bogged down in those kind of questions? Those are questions of policy or action. You can listen to the news and see for yourself firsthand where people are getting stuck, perhaps because of a question of what we should do. Perhaps it's a mixed question of judgment. So I spend time on that with people because if you have a clear understanding of what the nature of the question is, are we talking about a done thing? Are we talking about a question of values or judgment and how we create the criteria? Are we talking about what we ought to do? Each of those questions have different characteristics, and each of those tend to inspire different kinds of behavior that we observe in people who are having difficulty. The question of policy, the question of action, what we should do, starts a question cycle all over again. What were the effects of our choice? Was it a wise choice? Which, by the way, is what? It's a question of value. Was it a wise choice? Was it the right thing to do? What were the effects of our choice is a fact. So this interconnection between facts, value, and policy or action, those are the broad categories of things that I watch people disagree about all the time. Now, a question from Brother Clayton, first type of debate about facts and fake news. Do I find myself debating facts more in your line of work? I don't, because I don't debate facts. When I'm helping somebody, acting as a neutral, listening and conveying messages, in that context, usually it's going to lead to some kind of action. People tend to come to me as a mediator because they want something. They want to make a trade. They want to negotiate. They want to achieve a trade. Trades happen when people's values or value intersects. So I tend to just not get drawn into that. Sometimes if people have a side conversation or they direct the conversation in a way that's headed that way, I tend honestly to just ignore it and try to gently, without saying, hey, you're off topic, I try to bring it back. So a lot of this is shepherding, rather than saying, oh, come on, let's not talk about that nonsense. Do I see people arguing with realities? Yes. And that was before the era of fake news. And by arguing with reality, I mean having a difficulty accepting and processing what's the right decision to get out of this conflict. And that's where I believe we are all called, whether we're dispute resolvers by trade and profession or not. That's when we're called to employ some of the techniques I'm going to discuss in a few minutes to help people make a better decision, to help people as an act of autonomy and as an act of faith, make the decision that is the healthiest one for them. It's a good question. I'd like to give you an example of applying the golden rule because I had a discussion that ended up, somebody thought it was a question of fact. It ended up being a value question. And it's a quick anecdote to illustrate a Christian-based, faith-based approach to avoid a conflict. So a few months ago, I'm at the auto dealership and I went into the quiet room. There's a quiet room where if you want to work and not be disturbed, you can go and sit. I went in there. I was wearing a mask consistent with what my doctor would prefer that I do. Someone came in without a mask and started a conversation. All right, that's violating the rules a little bit. And I could tell pretty quickly where this person wanted to go because I went to Baylor Law School when I moved to Texas and went to Baylor Law School in Waco, Texas. I had met 2 Baptists in my life. Okay, I had met 2, so I didn't realize moving from Northern Illinois I had not dealt with many Southern Baptists. That's neither here nor there. I was simply inexperienced. Clearly, this person wanted to talk to me about faith. That's fine. The question started out, may I ask you something? Are you a Christian and have you been saved? And I said, yes and yes. Really, what church do you go to? St. Matthew's Episcopal. Oh, what's the Episcopal Church like? I said, well, it's a liturgy-based services. It's a well-established church, been around for a long time. And then the questions quickly got into things like, you don't have women serving as ministers, do you? Well, yes, we do. Well, the series of questions and commentary I was having a good time because I was just listening, because I thought this is an opportunity for me to listen to somebody who has a very different viewpoint. And let's just say it was a tour de force. It was a complete tour de force. Have you asked that woman who calls herself a minister? I said, she's a priest. Have you asked her if she has repented? No. Are you going to? I said, no. Well, why not? I said, we always ask for forgiveness, whenever we get together. You do? Almighty and ever living God, we most humbly confess that we've sinned against thee. So I recited, I said, yeah, of course we do. Oh, well, and she was trying to find a way to tell me that we were all going to hell. And I knew that going in. Now, I could have shut down the conversation. I could have said, you're violating the rules of the forum here. There's just two of us. I want to work. But I was so curious because I wanted to understand what was underlying all of this and her fervent desire to advocate to me. So I sat and listened, and she went on probably 10 minutes. After which she said, what do you think of all this? Now, who has a good response for that? I'm going to give you a tip about listening. When she got done and said, what do you think about this? I paused and I said, I don't really have a response because I wasn't listening to try to figure out a response. I said, I was just listening to you. She said, well, but surely you have a response. And I said, no, I really don't. I said, I was just politely listening. She said, well, you must have a viewpoint. And I said, well, yes, I do. We disagree. And I began to elaborate, and she interrupted. And I raised my hand and I said, I listened politely to you, but if you're going to cut me off, you're telling me that you want to just talk at me instead of talk with me. I'm happy to engage in a conversation with you, but it's going to be a reciprocal conversation. And if you don't want to pay me the same courtesy, then I'm not interested in continuing. Okay, that's fine. But the long and the short of it at the end, after coming back with another round of telling me why all of us are going to hell, I said, ma'am, we just disagree. We just disagree, but I want to know, can we agree on one thing to close this conversation? Can we agree that God loves both of us? Well, yes, we can. And I said, we'll see. Not so disagreeable and not so different after all, which is just an application of the golden rule in conversation. Lots of conflict, lots of potential for dispute, but by choosing not to and simply listening, because of curiosity and wanting to pay respect, the simplest concession you can ever give anyone is respect. The second one, which requires patience and discipline, is listening. And if you can do those two things, you're on your way to being a good conflict manager and dispute resolver. So to summarize and pull these threads together, when you're thinking about resolving a dispute, I believe the first step is understanding what type of question is at the core. Because if you know what type of question you're facing, then those of us who work in this field, we can plan the intervention techniques. It's like, if any of you are trained as physicians or healthcare providers, you take a history from the patient. You don't develop a treatment plan until you have brought together from patient history, from diagnostic imaging or blood work, from your own observation, from the patient's report of symptoms. All this data goes into figuring out what type of treatment plan or interventions are appropriate. It's exactly the same in dispute resolving work. We are thinking about what is the heart of the question, and before we start to spin out answers or give helpful suggestions. So I'm going to come back to that very important question about comfort food. I'm going to look in the chat. I'm not able to open the chat. I saw chicken wings. Oh, here it is. Banana bread, ribs, and baked potatoes. Oatmeal, chicken soup, ice cream sundae, apple pie, tacos. Warm homemade pound cake from my mother's kitchen. All right. Brother Tom, I'm going to come back to that one. Chicken fried steak and tomato and potatoes. You can get a lot of that in Houston. Brother Chris, ice cream of all kinds. There is no bad kind of ice cream. A Boston cream donut. Wow. Where do I get that? Enchiladas. So why do we talk about comfort food? The reason is that comfort foods, understanding comfort food will help you understand disputes. All right. What do I mean by that? Most of the comfort foods, the ones that were entrees and not desserts, shared this in common. They had some kind of starch for volume. They had a fat or a protein for satiety, giving the feeling of satiation. And they usually had a sauce or a warm liquid. Doesn't necessarily have to be spicy, whether it's chicken and dumplings, whether it's enchiladas. That's a template for comfort food. And by the way, you can go anywhere in the world and find comfort food, and you will find those basic ingredients. Just like disputes have only 3 ingredients. There are only 3 things about which people dispute. Now, so I can take a break and sip some tea because it is cedar season in Austin, Texas. What are the 3? There are only 3 types of things about which people dispute. 3 ingredients to every stew of a dispute. Anybody want to call them out?
Can I look at your PowerPoint and cheat?
You can, but as long as you're confessing, asking for forgiveness. But anybody who doesn't have the benefit, what are the kinds of things people fight about?
It's facts.
Yes, but we're gonna set those aside because we're gonna go find an authoritative source. It's a good answer, Carl. And yes, they do, and those are easily. I called you Carl. It's Kent. I'm sorry. I'm going to give you.
What about money?
There you go. That's one of them. My formula is L plus P plus M. Love, power, and money. You name me any dispute, a dispute with an auto repair shop, a dispute between nations. It is only about 3 kinds of ingredients: love, power, and money. If you say it's about esteem or identity, love or perception of self. Power is easy to understand. Money or economics is easy to understand. And those are the 3 things that everybody fights about. And the common ingredient is connection. And if we go back to Brother Tom, who talked not only about the dish, but he talked about it fresh from his mother's kitchen. And that, my friends, tells you about connection. People dispute over things to which they have some kind of strong connection. And understanding that connection is a key to figuring out how to help someone disconnect, if that's the right thing for them, or make some changes that modifies the effect of the dispute and improves it. So a lot of times when I do this exercise, when I do it with the law school students, I get them to talk about the comfort food. And the things they tend to talk about are childhood, loved ones, happy times, and their culture or tradition. And think about it. Ask somebody about a favorite comfort food. My sainted grandmother's lemon meringue pie, which is a dish that no one in the world could ever reproduce. I'm not talking about pie. I'm talking about my grandmother. I just turned 62 years old. She died when I was 7. And I still, sometimes I have a hard time talking about her, and I remember lemon meringue pie. So it's about connection and what kind of connections people have to the things that cause them distress or the things that they debate about. So the next truism about this whole notion of what people get into disputes about you can't resolve an emotional problem or an emotional dispute with logic alone. Some people try to do that. I know that nobody has ever had someone in their life who's significant to them say, you know, we could just get through this if you would be logical, if you would be rational. And I know that nobody here has ever said that to a significant person in their life. If you could just bear down and think about this logically, or think about the facts, or be realistic, which are all ways of saying, if you would just think about this the way I think about it, it would be better. Think about how we disguise the message by saying, if you would only be fill in the blank, then you could work through this. When again, we know what we're really saying, we just don't think about it. It's especially true if a dispute is unconfined. Now, by a confined versus an unconfined dispute, a confined dispute is when somebody, like the people today who came to me, I would like to settle my lawsuit today. I know that their decision-making processes are going to be driven by risk and cost-benefit analysis, and will the paying party, am I stuck still? Holy moly.
We hear you.
I'm back as Will Archer, who I'm really not.
Okay.
But it's about making a trade. But when somebody comes and says, will you help me settle a dispute with my loved one? I can't get along with my child. I don't like the person my child is in love with or going to marry. I really can't stand fill in the blank. My neighbor, my business partner, my sibling. When people bring those kind of disputes, we know that that's an unconfined dispute, and that's going to be driven by a number of things. And the idea is not, I know that we will trade something and make it better, like you do in a lawsuit. We know that it's about trying to find the balance between love, power, and money, and getting things positioned so people can tolerate the result and go forward in a peaceful, loving way. When, if anyone remembers the Camp David Accords brokered by President Carter involving Prime Minister Begin and President Sadat, there's some pictures of how they're smiling. If you go to the Carter Center in Atlanta and learn about some of the history of the Camp David Accords, the Camp David Accords almost didn't happen. In fact, Sadat and Begin were going to go their separate ways. And Sadat had asked President Carter to sign some pictures for his grandchildren. And what President Carter did for both of them, he had learned the grandchildren's names. And he personalized each one of them to fill in grandchild's name. And he handed them out. And President Carter said that each time they took them, held them, and looked at them. Now, is that manipulation? Is that good mediation? Is it causing someone to refrain? They decided to stay. They decided to stay and keep working. Why? Because that unconfined dispute was brought into some very real love, power, money, heavy on the L element, and that helped bring things together. If you're familiar with the Good Friday Accords, negotiated by Senator George Mitchell to bring an end to the conflict in Northern Ireland, Senator Mitchell, on the Monday of Holy Week, had everybody together, and he pulled out, a flimsy paper ticket like we used to get to travel on an airplane. And he sat everybody down and he said, in his thick Maine accent, I want you to know that I'm spending Easter with my family. You are very close. We will work as hard as it takes, but I want everybody to see my airplane ticket because I am leaving on Saturday. Regardless of where we are, I'm leaving. And he said he thought that was the right amount of pressure to apply at that time because it was gentle pressure to focus on something that was ahead, Easter. And of course, so much of that intractable long conflict has to do with religious faith. Good Friday, Easter Sunday, it was a season where there was commonality of interest and importance of the holiday. And they worked very hard that week, and that's why they're called the Good Friday Accords, because that's when they were announced. An acquaintance of mine who mediated the reconstruction of the government of South Africa after apartheid. You can read the story of how that happened. There were 2 weeks at a retreat in rural England with the representatives of both sides. His rule for the first week was, we're not going to talk about the reconstruction of the government of South Africa. Now you hear that and you think, well, that's really strange. Everybody agreed, if not for the first week, the second week wouldn't have led to success. Because by the end of the first week, people were starting to sit together at meals. People were starting to exchange pictures, show pictures of family and friends. They developed a connection. So what are we seeing? It's settling an undefined dispute. Part of Psalm 120 that always sticks with me. Too long have I had my dwelling among those who hate peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. Now, I'll have to admit, the first few times I thought deeply about that, I thought, yeah, that's right. I'm the one trying to help with peace and all these other people want war. But as I've reflected on that section from the Psalms, I have a different viewpoint. And it was taught to me by something, I realized it after something a student said. When I was talking and relating the story of the Camp David Accords, this student said, you don't have any idea how difficult that really was. Can you imagine what it would be like sitting across the negotiating table from your most hated enemy who believes you don't have a right to exist, who has historically murdered women, children, old people? Can you imagine what it's like to sit across from your worst enemy? And was anybody here listening to that thinking that that student was Egyptian? That caused me to think. And she said her viewpoint was President Carter was not an honest broker. This was all strong arm. President Sadat did what he had to do to save our country. But he was dealing with our worst enemies who hate us and think we don't have a right to exist and killed men, women, and children. And I have to tell you, that caused me to pause and think, all right, my preconceived notions about what that was about were challenged. Too long have I had my dwelling among those who hate peace. I'm for peace, but they're not. So I'm going to skip through because I do want to leave us that time for some questions near the end. Here's the secret weapon. Hard to talk about a weapon in peacemaking. Here's a secret technique. You know how to do it. It's listening. In James 1, beginning at verse 19, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Now, listening is a discipline. I've done entire day-long trainings for companies and for state agencies about listening. We spend an entire 3-hour class in my negotiation class talking about listening. what I urge people to do is listen for emotions. You already know how to listen. Your conversation partner will tell you about how they think and process information. And the very, very quick way to do it, have you ever noticed, listen to how people describe the very process of thinking. Have you heard people who say, I'd like to get a look at that. I don't see that clearly. You know, this is murky or cloudy. Those people are visual learners, visual processors. What about people who say, I want to get my arms around this. This doesn't have the right feel. This rubs me the wrong way. Those are people who are tactile dominant learners. What about people like me who say, that didn't sound right. That's discordant. Auditory dominant learners. So if we had extensive time, we would talk about how you can listen for how someone expresses not only emotions, which are more important than the words, but how they process information and how communicating back, you can find a way that makes it easier to reach your counterpart. I had a very difficult client once who we went round and round and round and round. I thought he wasn't taking my good advice. And what finally dawned on me is every time he talked about this strategic move, it was in the language of war and combat. You know, we've got to fight and we've got to launch a salvo and we've got to do this. And it dawned on me, I said, all right, I'm going to speak to him in the language of combat. I said, you know what? It's unwise to fight over territory you can't hold, right? So if you're fighting over something, how about something that is going to minimize your losses, maximize your gain, and not fight over territory that you can't hold? Well, that makes a lot of sense. Well, guess what? He suddenly decided that I was thinking correctly. And for things we'd been talking about for 3 days, when I figured out how to talk with him, not to him, kismet, all of a sudden, it was a miracle. You can't solve an emotional problem with logic alone, and you won't have a successful conversation if you try to soften someone's hardened opinion with emotions. Aligning what you have to say with how your counterpart thinks and why your counterpart thinks and, more importantly, feels, that's the key to resolving disputes. Let's leave some time for questions. I'm gonna hold up some books while you're formulating your questions. If you are interested in a sociological study of why people dispute, and it's long, one of the best books I've ever read, it's about 400 pages, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And this gives a sociological and an evolutionary explanation for why people fight about politics and religion. It's called The Righteous Mind. Another one, which is New York Times bestseller, is called Difficult Conversations. Difficult Conversations, Doug Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen, H-E-E-N, How to Discuss What Matters. Specifically applied to politics. This is a fun read. These authors have a podcast. I think you're wrong, but I'm listening. Fascinating, quick study book, and it's fun to read. It's by two friends, one with red viewpoint, one of blue. I think you're wrong, but I'm listening. And finally, Nobel Peace Prize finalist, Dr. Scilla Ellsworthy. This one is a little harder to find. It's called The Business Plan for Peace. Dr. Ellsworthy has a non-governmental organization that tries to promote peace throughout the world. And Dr. Ellsworthy, whose background is management, says, we're not going to have peace unless it becomes somebody's job. And it's not enough to just say, we want peace, because that's a great thing. Dr. Ellsworthy said, if we're going to build a world without war, now what she's trying to solve is on a bigger scale, then we've got to have a business plan. So I will send, along with the PowerPoint that caused so much trouble, for which I'm sorry, I'll send you the titles and the authors of these books. So in the time that remains, thank you for listening, letting me carry on. Anybody have a quick question before we close? I'll turn it back over to Conrad.
Brother Jeff, or should we call you Brother Will, as your as your title shows there. Thank you so much. Yeah, if you get those titles over to myself or Roy, we'll make sure that and for all of you on the call here tonight, we will put those in our reading lists on our bi-weekly newsletter that comes out. You'll see them referenced there. We certainly thank you so much for your patience with our internet issues that we were having tonight, but that's what it was all about, was us learning how to sit and wait patiently, and we were eventually going to hear what we needed to hear. Anybody else have any other questions? If not, I'll close this with a prayer. And we are recording this, so as soon as it's over, I'll record it, and we'll make sure we get it posted to our new website. Brother, Kent Miller. Yes, sir.
Yeah, can I get the information if I'm not on your newsletter list?
You can, but we'd love to have you on our newsletter list.
I sent you my email. Will that do it?
That will do it. Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, that'll get you all the information we can give to you. Hopefully you'll spread the word about us too. Well, brothers, thank you all so much for tonight. And Jeff, really thank you. It really was a pleasure. And you started us off in 2023, just fantastic.
You're very welcome.
Brothers, you join me in prayer. I was searching while the last part of the presentation, the last 5 minutes or so. I apologize, Jeff, but I was looking for an appropriate prayer out of the Book of Common Prayer for this particular topic. I hope I've come across the right one. So, brothers, let us pray. Oh God, our Father, whose Son forgave his enemies while he was suffering shame and death, strengthen those who suffer for the sake of conscience. When they are accused, save them from speaking in hate. When they are rejected, save them from bitterness. When they are in prison, save them from despair. And to us, your servants, give grace to respect their witness and to discern the truth, that our society may be cleansed and strengthened. This we ask for the sake of Jesus Christ, our merciful and righteous judge. Amen.
Amen. I'm going to put my email address into the chat. Feel free to email me if you like.
Fabulous. Thank you
Glad
so
to
much.
continue the
Jeff.
conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.